Yeah, hi. So today I'm gonna give a lecture about whip speeches because I was told that a lot of people wanted to see how whip speeches should be done. And in the process, I thought that I it would be useful maybe to talk about how to rebut and weigh within whip speeches. So I'm gonna talk about what I usually do when I do whip speeches because I have only done like whip for AP. So yeah, I hope it would be helpful to see like how another person does a whip speech. And like just a few disclaimers that I want to talk about before I start this lecture is that firstly, this definitely isn't the only way or the best way to do a whip speech. So like it would be great if you guys consider this as just like one of a personal experiences that I found to be useful. And secondly, I think like some things might not be like the best way that works for you. So like you could just like pick the things that you might seem to be useful for you, and then like that hopefully might help. Yeah, great. So yeah, these are the table of contents that I want to cover today. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the composition of a whip speech, and I'm basically going to talk about the structure of a whip speech, what should be inside a whip speech and stuff like that. Secondly, I'm going to talk about rebuttals, and I'm going to talk about like especially what I use to rebut a lot in whip speeches because like I think like rebuttals, generally every speech does have some amount of rebuttals in them, but when it comes to whip speeches, because it's important to intensively focus on rebuttals. There are some methods of rebuttals that might be useful for whip speeches in particular, which I think is the case. And thirdly, we're going to talk about weighing, which should be at the end of every clash in a whip speech, basically, and is important. So yeah, that's going to be what we are going to talk about today. So yeah, basically starting off with the composition of a whip speech. I think that a whip speech basically has like three things inside a speech. Firstly, you give an introduction in a whip speech. Secondly, you signpost and say like, hey, like these are the clashes that I want to talk about. And then thirdly, you identify the clashes and talk about those clashes in particular. I'm not gonna go through what a clash is in like too much detail because I would assume that like the those who do a whip speech would know to some degree what clashes are and that like speeches should consist of clashes. But I am going to talk about like what should be inside clashes and how to construct clashes well in order to be an effective whip speaker. So yeah, let's go through these three things one by one and talk about like what should be the composition of the things that are here and then like how to do these things. So yeah, firstly, starting with the intro. I think that when it comes to the introduction, a introduction in a whip speech is not always necessary, meaning that it's good to have an intro. You might not want like have an introduction. Like you could just say like I'm gonna have talk about three clashes in this debate and jump straight into clashes, which is what I actually often do. But also, I think that whip speeches might need introduction in the sense that it may be useful to reframe the debate or make major callouts towards opposition teams throughout your whip speech. So I don't think that the whip speech should have an introduction for the sake of having an introduction, but it's always useful to make like major clarifications or major reframing at the start of the speech to kind of like suggest where the speech is going and where the debate should go and like have a very like strong impression towards the judge. So what I usually do when I make an introduction, when I need to make an introduction is like firstly, I try to make important call outs. So if the opposition is making like really unfair characterizations about a topic, saying that like an opposition is like trying to say, hey, like the case that the government team presented is like wrong, and then like they're kind of making unfair characterizations about a certain stakeholder or an actor. Or maybe like the opposing team is pushing an unfair burden for your team. So for example, like if you're doing a policy motion and the opposition is like if you are the opposition team and the government team is suggesting that you must have an alternative and prove why that alternative is actually going to be more effective compared to the policy, then that's not a like fair burden for your team, right? You can still win without having an alternative. So in these kind of cases, then the other team is pushing an unfair burden towards your team. I think that you can say, hey, like, no, like that is not the burden of our team at the start of the debates or start of the speech. Yeah. And thirdly, there could be teams that strawman your team's case, meaning that they completely misrepresent parts of your team's case in a manner that is critical for your team, then I think it's also important to kind of like note that at the start of your speech when you're the whip speaker. The point I want to make here is like, when it comes to the whip speech, I think oftentimes a lot of debates tend to get really messy. There are a lot of things going around. And the whip speech is the last chance to kind of clarify that and like clean that all up, right? So at the intro of the whip speech, I think it's important for the speaker to kind of um like just like set up where the speech is going to happen and say like, hey, this debate is actually about this, and then kind of clarify what your team stance is. Yeah. So secondly, I think that in the introduction, in the same sense, it's also a good idea to kind of have a reframing towards the debate. So meaning that if you think that the debate was very parallel and both teams were talking about different things, then you could say, hey, this debate isn't necessarily about A, which is what the opposition team wants to talk about, but it's actually about B, right? So for example, like when I was like doing one AP debate, there was this motion that said like this house believes that the state should fund cosmetic surgery. And the other team talked a lot about why cosmetic surgery is like really helpful to people who are like not confident about their looks. So like as the whip speaker, you would say, hey, like this debate isn't necessarily about cosmetic surgery or whether or not people should do cosmetic surgery, but rather this debate is like about whether or not the state should fund cosmetic surgery. And that's a completely different issue, right? So you can kind of talk about that and like talk about why the debate, if you want to shift the focus of the debate into what you think is more important, I think it's a good idea to kind of like flesh that out at the start of your speech and say, hey, this debate isn't necessarily about what they want to say, but it's actually about what we want to say, and then kind of shift the focus of the debate. Thirdly, I think it's also a good idea to clarify because like as I just said, like especially in debates, which you might like see in like KNC, like it's very easy for debates to get very messy at the start, like at the point of where you make a speech. And then in that point, you could just like kind of clarify and make your team stance much more clear by saying, so what we wanted to say as a stance is actually like something, something. And that would also be a good idea to do at the start of your whip speech. Um, the point I want to talk about here in general is like, I don't think it's a good idea for whip speeches to kind of focus on points that are necessarily too minor at the start of the intro, because when it comes to whip speech, I think like because the whip speech is the last speech in as a constructive speaker and you're the last one who can make a change, the first impression of a speech I feel is very important when you guys like first start speaking in front of the judge. So like I think it's a better idea in general to kind of look at the debate from a general macro level perspective. Don't focus on like specific trees, but focus more on the forest. That would be a better idea of how I would like make a whip speech. And I think this doesn't only apply at the introduction for the introduction, but also for other parts of the speeches as well. So like I think it's always important for a whip speaker to kind of look at the debate from a macro level perspective. Great. Then after you make the introduction, I guess like the second thing that you would do is signpost. And by signposting, I mean that you would say, hey, like these are the clashes that I'm going to discuss in this debate. And I think this is kind of like pretty basic, but signposting I feel is always important when you are making speeches because like firstly it makes the speech generally much more clear, meaning that it makes the judge much more easier to take notes of what you are trying to do in your speech. But like secondly, it also makes your speech kind of more clear when you are making speech because you can say like, oh, I'm going to talk about these two clashes, and then it also gives a guideline for you to follow when you're making the speech. So I think it's always a good idea to kind of like keep your speech organized by signposting and say like these are the two clashes that I'm going to discuss in this speech, and then like yeah, that might be useful. And yeah, the important thing when you have to do when you're signposting is to identify clashes, right? And I think that when you identify clashes, a lot of questions that I get when people ask me about whip speeches is to ask me like how to identify clashes, like how do you identify clashes, like how do you find the clashes in a debate? So I think that this is really like dependent on the nature of the debate and which debate you are in. But just to give a few examples of how I would like make guidelines about this, I just like brought three examples of how you could identify clashes in a debate. Firstly, I think it's a good idea to talk about clashing principles if the debate has a clashing principle, because like a lot of debates would have this like principle argument, right? And then like you could talk about then why one principle is actually more important than another principle, or why your principle actually is like better proven or fleshed out, and that could be one part of the clash, right? And then the second thing is, I think, is like a deadlock. And I don't think a deadlock has to be this fancy term. I think basically what you have to deal with at clashes as a lip speaker is to kind of talk about issues that had a lot of airtime from the previous speakers, but you still feel like the issue isn't resolved to the fullest extent. So if you feel like both teams focused on one issue for a long period of time, but you still feel like your team is not winning on that issue, then it's probably a good idea to discuss that within a clash, right? Yeah. So I think the third thing that you can identify as clashes is like to respond to unresponded but important portions of the opposing team. And I think this is really important because I've seen a lot of whip speakers and also like a lot of my students when I like teach at Hamons that only just like respond to the points that are kind of minor from the other team, but like is an important clash for your team. So meaning that you kind of focus on points where your team is stronger. But I don't think this is necessarily a good strategy for whip because if the previous speakers have already made this very strong points about a issue, then probably you're winning on that issue anyways, even if you don't flesh it out from the whip speaker, meaning that it's probably going to be a waste of time if you spend a lot of your speech time talking about issues that you are already winning. Instead, I think it's very important for the whip speaker to respond to portions that are not responded yet from your previous speakers, meaning that like the opposing team might have this argument that they feel like is a very strong argument coming from their team, and you would also feel like this is important to respond to, but your previous speakers might not have had the opportunity or the time to respond to this, then I think it's much more important to focus your speech on responding to the material that is left unresponded. So if you were to identify clashes and you had this one clash that's already like well established from your team and another clash that needs to be dealt with from like because it has a lot of material coming from the opposing team, then I would suggest focusing on the latter because it's going to be much more important in the debate as a whip speaker. Yeah, to do. Yeah. So then like the issue is how to deal with clashes, right? Because like we all know that we should identify clashes and we should resolve clashes at whip speakers. But yeah, like it's better easier said than done. How you can explain the clashes and how you can like win over the clashes is a completely different issue, right? And I think like just a lot of speakers just tend to do like a lot of rebuttals within a clash, which is actually what I also do. And I think that's like a good idea. But like when I think like when basically you're talking about clashes, the reason why you're talking about clashes is because you feel like the issue or the clash that you're talking about is important to the debate, and winning that clash is going to influence the result of the debate, right? So I think it's very important to kind of give a full story about that clash, basically give a full rebuttal to the points that are within the clash and have a conclusion to that clash. Especially, I think it's very important to have a conclusion of why your team won the clash. And I'm going to explain this a bit more when I explain how clashes are going to be done. Yeah. So basically, when you construct clashes, I don't, also for this, I don't think there is a set way of how you can just like make clashes or resolve clashes or do clashes. But like what I found was useful for me is like this kind of like template. And um I don't think this template always works, nor do I think that this is the way that every person should follow. I just like kind of try to think about how I constructed my clashes and just like kind of try to organize it in a form of a template. But even for me, I just like sometimes take other methods if I feel like it's necessary. So I think this is just like a 참고 자료 for people to see. Yeah. So yeah, within the clashes, I think like the basic templates that you could just like refer to when you are first starting off with whip speeches is to like firstly explain what the clash is, and then you would just like be quite concise about this, meaning that you would explain, hey, like the first clash is about like the principle maybe, and then within this you would explain what the competing claims of the opposition side and your side is. Like briefly you would say like, hey, for this clash our team's claim was this, but the opposing team's claim was this, very briefly, and you would be very clear about what you identified as a clash. I think this is important. And oftentimes I think that clashes come in the form of questions. For example, which side, so when it was for the show debate that happened a few days back, the topic was like, the motion was like, this us would like, as an individual would live according to law of Yante or something. And then like the clashes that we discussed when we were like discussing the results of the round was to talk about like whether or not this what was it, like whether or not children are going to be cocky to the degree that it's going to be harmful for them or not, or that could be like a clash that you could identify. So basically a clash could be in the form of a question of which team does what better, or like just a topic that both teams talked about a lot. So I think like there's no set format about this. And then the second thing that you would do after introducing the title of the clash is to kind of like rebut and reconstruct, right? And then like when I mean rebut, you would rebut to the claims coming from the opposing team and then kind of try to reconstruct to your team's case, talking about the rebuttals that were given from the opposing team and then kind of reconstruct your team's case. And the thing I want to note here is that I think it's very easy for whip speakers to become repetitive. And the reason is that because whip speakers don't have a lot of time to prepare for the speeches, this means that they oftentimes kind of like prepare rebuttals in advance when during prep time or during like the former speeches, listening to maybe LO and then like preparing for rebuttals on your own. But oftentimes your teammates kind of like use the rebuttals in their speeches earlier on. So like now you have the same rebuttals, but you just like still say it anyways because it's on your script. And where while I do think that is better than like going under time or like not saying anything, I also think that if your teammates have already made the rebuttals that you were trying to make, it's a better idea to kind of like use your time in something else, like for example, giving more comparatives or giving more weighing, rather than just repeating the same rebuttals. Because like I don't think that's a good use of time when your teammates already gave those rebuttals. But secondly, I think that's also very bad for this like speaker points because like judges don't like repetitiveness, right? So the key here is just like don't make new rebuttals that can be new responses to the claims of the opposing team. Don't just um don't feel afraid to not completely discard the rebuttals that the former teammates already did if you feel like those rebuttals are repetitive. Yeah. So basically, yeah. And then, so when you rebut a claim from the opposing team, I think that Yeonsu might have covered this because she also made a lecture on rebuttals. And honestly, I didn't watch Yeonsu's lecture, so I don't know what Yeonsu did or said in her lecture. But like obviously rebuttals to the arguments could be like denial, mitigation, like tipping point, and other methods of rebuttals that people could use. And yeah, what I want to do here a few slides later is to kind of talk about like mitigation and tipping point analysis because like I think denial is pretty intuitive for people. So like you say that an argument is wrong. When it comes to mitigation and tipping point, I think it's useful to use within clashes because you can like link it with the comparative and make it a very strong rebuttal. So I'm going to talk about this later. But basically what I wanted to talk about here is to say that like when you're making clashes, like a large portion within the clash should be focused on rebuttals because that's basically what the whip speaker can do and that's what the whip speaker should focus on. So the next thing after making a lot of rebuttals for constructing, and the important thing is like to make comparatives, I think. And I don't think comparatives are always very always like strictly distinguished from rebuttals, meaning that sometimes comparatives are mixed into rebuttals, sometimes you make a comparative and then rebut, like sometimes those two things are like murky, they're kind of blended together. But I think like after making rebuttals, it's also a good idea to kind of consciously make comparatives towards the other team. And when I was a novice debater, I didn't know what comparatives were. So like a lot of people told me, hey, like you should be more comparative. And I was like, yeah, like what is being comparative? Like I didn't understand this, right? But I don't think making like comparatives have they sound fancy, but I don't think it's a very difficult term. So basically, when I mean comparatives, I mean like you should compare your team's arguments versus the opposing team's arguments, and then after rebutting and reconstructing your team's case, you should compare those two things and then kind of explain why is it that your team's material is left standing? Why is it that your team has a better result compared to the other team's material? So basically, when it comes to like maybe issues, let's go back to the Yamte example. Let's say the government said children are gonna be cocky when they don't follow the law of Yante. So we should teach children the law of Yante. And then if that is the claim that you want to make from government, then the comparative would be like on our side, children are more modest, they have more friends and stuff like that. On the comparative, in the opposition team, children will not have friends. They will be very cocky. They will have like a sad life in the future. So basically, you just like compare the arguments from the other team and compare the likelihood, what is left standing from the other team. Like you can explicitly say, oh, we successfully rebutted this claim. We proved why this is not likely compared to the other claims that from the other side. And then you kind of discuss that at the end of making rebuttals. Yeah. And then after doing this, like the fourth thing you would do is probably weigh. And I also think that weighing is sometimes not distinguishable from making comparatives. Like it's sometimes not distinguishable from rebutting. But basically, weighing is talking about why your team's arguments are more important compared to the other team. And I think we'll also talk more about this in a couple of slides back. And then the fifth thing, which I think is very important, is to kind of conclude the clash. Because like I think like when people construct clashes, like what I did and what also a lot of people do is just like kind of like talk about like, hey, we're gonna talk about clash A, and then you would say all of these things that the opposite, like the opposing team said, and you would like go line by line through those like rebuttals and say like, we have these rebuttals, and then after that you would just say, so the second clashes and just like move on to the second clash, right? But like I think that the point of rebuttals, like the point of making those rebuttals and point of clashes is to prove that your team won that clash, right? So like although this might sound technical, I think it's pretty important for you to kind of conclude that clash and say, because of these reasons, because of the reasons that we talked about, because like our argument is more important, blah, 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 we have taken this clash home. This means that because we have won this clash, we have proven why this most important stakeholder is more benefited under our side, and this is why we are winning this debate. I think this kind of rhetoric is very important when you conclude the clash, meaning that like I think it's important to explicitly conclude the clash, explicitly say that this clash has been taken by government team or like opposition team, but like depending on which side you are. And obviously you would be the team that won this clash, like if you were like doing the speaker. So I think just like concluding the clash with having this like one-liner like sentence about how your team won the clash is quite important. And this also acts as signposting. So yeah, also in terms of the organization. Cool. Yeah. So what I want to do now is I want to just like talk about like rebutting here and then like weighing here one by one and kind of explain what is actually how like what are the methods to actually rebut in clashes, what are the methods to actually weigh stuff in clashes, because yeah, that's what that's what I want to do basically. So I'm gonna start off by talking about rebuttals. And the thing here is, yeah, so like I listed a lot of possible rebuttals, and this is obviously not an exhaustive list, meaning that there could be like various methods of how debaters could rebut to claims from the other team. But like I just like picked two methods that I find useful and use a lot in like whip speeches. Yeah, so like that's what I'm good at. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this lecture. Yeah, and Yeah, so like the two things that I'm going to talk about in terms of rebuttals is like mitigation and tipping points. And the reason why I'm not talking about denial is because I think it's pretty intuitive. You're basically saying that something is not likely or something is wrong. And this is basically a very typical way of rebutting that everyone actually uses. And the reason why I'm then talking about mitigation and tipping point is because I feel like these two kind of rebuttals are especially useful in whip speeches, because in other speeches, if you just mitigate or you just use tipping point analysis, this is kind of going to be insufficient to completely rebut to the argument from the opposing side. But when you're a whip speaker and using this within the clashes, then you can kind of say like, we're going to mitigate the arguments from the other team. We're going to prove why these impacts are not going to manifest because this doesn't fulfill the tipping point. And then comparing this to the other team, our arguments have like larger benefits and larger impacts. So that's why our arguments win this clash. So basically, I think mitigation tipping point analysis is useful when you kind of like use it as a full story within a clash to say that the other team's arguments are like not impactful as much, but you can kind of like prove why then your arguments are more impactful in the comparative. So it's always useful to use these with the comparative, and that's why I think it's useful in whip speeches. But anyways, yeah, we're gonna look at these things one by one. So like even if you don't know what tipping point and mitigation is at this point, it's like completely fine. Yeah. So when it comes to rebuttals, the basic thing I want to lay out in terms of rebuttals is to say like oftentimes I think it's insufficient for probably like all of the speakers in the debate, but especially insufficient for a whip speaker to just say that something is wrong or something is incorrect. And this is because like especially when it comes to whip speaker, you're the one who has to put the rebuttals into clashes and say like this clash has been taken by our team, right? And then, especially when it comes to this, I think it's like insufficient for a whip speaker to just say like, hey, like this thing is wrong because it doesn't really do anything for the round, right? Like if you can just say like the claim for the other from the other team is wrong, like good, sure, but like why is that important? You need to prove why then your team like still wins that clash, right? So I think it's because it is insufficient for whip speakers to simply say that something is wrong, so we win this debate, then I think like it's more important for whip speakers to kind of intensively rebut to the material that came from the other team and make comparatives. Yeah. And then like just basic premises when making rebuttals. Yeah. And this I think applies not only to whip speeches, but probably to like a lot of like different kind of speeches that need to do rebuttals. But I'm just like highlighting this because like yeah. So firstly, I think that the consideration that you have to make when you are doing doing rebuttals is to ask yourself, is the argument from the like opposing team actually realistic, or does it actually happen in the status quo? Because if you think about it, I think when it comes to debates, a lot of debaters make arguments that are just like logically true, but not necessarily true in the real world because like they're caught up in the debate itself. So what I found useful personally when I was first trying to make rebuttals towards the other team is to think about like what actually happens in the status quo and consider, is the other team's claim something really what happens in the status quo? Is it reasonable and realistic? And then if your answer is no, so basically the metric I would use to like kind of figure this out is to think like, would this make sense if I talked about this argument to my mom in the dinner table? And then if my mom wouldn't find this convincing, then why would that be the case? Because like, yeah, usually parents are like non-debater people, right? So like usually it's one of these two things. Like isn't the what the opposing side argues too exaggerated, because it is sometimes exaggerated. If do people really react to the things like how the opposing side wants to argue? And if your answer is no, then why is this the case? I think this is where you can kind of start considering like how you can make rebuttals to an argument from the opposing team. And the reason why I think this is important is because I think this is like the underlying premise for mitigations and tipping points, which I'm going to explain a bit more. So the first method of rebuttal I want to talk about is mitigation. And basically, when I mean mitigation, the dictionary definition of mitigation is the action of reducing the severity or the seriousness or the painfulness of a harm. So basically, the point of a mitigation is not to say the argument of the other team is completely wrong or it's untrue or it's not going to happen, but to say that the severity or the seriousness is not as big as what the opposing team would say. So basically, if you're government and the opposition said that, hey, the harms of this argument is like 100 and the impact of this argument is 100, then you can say, hey, that's not really the case. We think that the harm of this is like about 50. And then one thing I want to note here is a lot of people say mitigations are weak. So like when you say that argument is mitigatory at best, then it's kind of like a bad thing, right? Because like an argument should not be mitigatory. But I use mitigations often and it has worked for me a lot of times. And I still think it can be very useful in whip speeches when it's combined with comparatives and weighing. Because when you are arguing a debate, unless the other team is like really stupid, I don't think it's likely that what the other team has said is going to be completely wrong, is likely to be completely wrong, because both of the teams have some stuff to say, and that is probably going to make sense to some degree, because like if it weren't, then that wouldn't be debatable, right? Yeah. So because of this, I think that like when it comes to mitigations, the good thing about mitigation is you don't have to prove why the other team's argument is completely wrong. You can just say, hey, the impact of the other team's argument is actually small. Compare this with the impact of our team's arguments. The impacts of our team's arguments are very big, meaning that if you compare these two impacts from these two teams, probably you should buy the arguments from our team because our team's arguments have much bigger of an impact. So that's how you can kind of resolve the clash, by mitigating and then comparing. Yeah. So then, how do you mitigate? I think the key to mitigation is to say that the harm X causes does not really lead to a degree of harm because of a lot of reasons that are existent in the status quo. So the likelihood analysis is very useful here, meaning that you would probably talk about a lot of reasons why the harms of the opposition team will not likely manifest or would not be as severe because of other reasons that exist in the status quo. So yeah, the purpose of mitigation basically isn't to say that the opposing side's arguments are 100% untrue, but rather to say that the impacts are not as big. And I think this becomes clear a bit more with examples. So yeah, let's talk about an example. Yeah, let's say that there is an argument that's like there is a motion that says this house regrets the use of explicit and graphic imagery of suffering to promote altruistic causes. So basically what you would argue for this motion is to say, hey, like if you so the motion like requires the debate to be like whether or not we should use these like really graphic, like really explicit, really visceral kinds of imagery to promote altruistic causes like charity. For example, like should UNICEF use like images of like starving Black children or not? Like I think that would be the debate. And then let's say that the government made this argument, like that says, if charitable organizations increasingly adopt explicit and graphic imagery, then people would have stereotypes because they would perceive people from a certain race, for example, like the African continent as a whole, to be very incapable and poor. Let's say that this is the government argument, which I think is a very like low-hanging argument that can come from government, right? Like people are going to have stereotypes and this is that. Then, if you were to have a mitigation towards this claim, you wouldn't try to say that this argument is completely false. You wouldn't try to say that this argument is like 100% not true. But what you would try to say is you would kind of try to mitigate or lessen the impact of this kind of stereotype. So you would say something like, the harms of this charity organization will not be as severe as what the government team suggests. This is because in the status quo, there exists a lot of education. There are a lot of like reality shows and documentaries and news sources that present the reality of the African continent, which means that even if people do have like certain stereotypes, these stereotypes are not going to be as severe because there are other reasons for people to like kind of other reasons for the stereotypes to be diminished in the status quo. So like this impact of what the government team is trying to suggest would be mitigated through this kind of arguments. Yeah. And yeah, so I hope that makes it like clear of how mitigation like works. I just want to try this with one more example. Yeah, let's say that there is a motion that says this thus believes that the practice of reference checking by companies does more harm than good. And this was like the motion of last year's BPRT, which was fun. Yeah. Let's say the government team's argument it was like reference checking is a mechanism that leads to individuals being punished by one or two bad relationships. If an individual is reference checked by a person who doesn't personally like the individual, then the individual will not be able to grasp job opportunities. Let's say that this is the argument that came from government, which I think is also a very typical argument. Then, like, what you would think of when you are looking at this argument for opposition is, you would consider, hey, like, is this really realistic in the status quo? Is this likely to happen? Is this isn't this like too exaggerated, or doesn't the aren't the impacts like too overly played or like underplayed? And then like you would think about this. And then like if I were on opposition and I looked at this argument, I would think something like, is it like really true that reference checking actually punishes people who have like one or two bad relationships? Because it kind of sounds extreme, right? And then you would think about why this is extreme. And I think the reason why this is extreme is because the impact that the government team wants to talk about is way too exaggerated compared to what actually happens in the status quo. And if this is the case, then you would try to mitigate this. So yeah, the mitigation to this would be like the harm of being disowned by one or two people is not likely to happen, or it's not likely to be as severe because companies still have other ways to check if a person is capable or compatible or not. So you would basically say that reference checking is not the only way that companies would choose people or choose to hire people. For example, company has have resumes, they have SOPs, they require SOPs for applicants, they have like recommendation letters, they have interviews, and there are so many other methods of that companies actually choose when recruiting individuals, right? So even if the individual has negative references by one or two people, this is not likely to lead to the individual immediately not being able to get the job, which mitigates the impact of this argument because this argument's impact was that individuals might be punished by one or two bad relationships, and this is a bad thing because it leads to individuals being punished severely even if they have like only one or two bad relationships, right? Then you would say probably this is not likely to happen. The impacts are not going to be as severe, and this could be a mitigation to this. Yeah. Great. The second type of rebuttals that I want to talk about is like tipping point analysis. And I think like tipping point analysis is kind of similar to mitigation in the sense that you're tackling the impact of an argument, but what you're trying to say or the conclusion you're trying to get at when you're doing tipping point analysis is to talk about why something is likely or not likely to happen anyways, regardless of the argument. So like the word tipping point by definition means the moment of critical mass or the threshold or the boiling point of something. Meaning that like, do you guys know like the joke about how like water never boils at 99 degrees, it only boils at 100. So then like in this example, 100 degrees would be the tipping point. So basically what you want to talk about with tipping point rebuttals is to say, so when the opposing team says that A is the reason for X, and then so if opposition wants to say that A causes X results, then you would say, no, A doesn't cause X results, or X result happens anyways. So you would say A is not the critical mass of something, or the impact that the opposing team argues. So what you would do basically is you could say, this could be argued by like, actually, the reason why X happens is not A, but also like B, C, and D. So like A is only one of the reasons why X happens, but this is not the most crucial reason, meaning that X is likely to happen regardless of A or not. So you would basically talk about the exclusive harms or benefits of a certain aspect and say that the impacts that the other team wants to claim will happen regardless or will not happen regardless of like A or B. So you would basically say that the result is not dependent on the mechanism that the other team has. So I also think this becomes a bit more clear of like its terms in terms of usage with examples. Let's say that there is this motion that says the South would ban trending lists, which I think is like a YTN motion. But anyways, yeah, trending lists are basically like trending lists on YouTube and stuff like that, like 실시간 검색어. Let's say the arguments that government gives is like trending lists lead to more addiction because people spend more time on social media watching the content on trending lists. Then, the tipping point analysis here would to say that trending lists are necessarily not the tipping point of addiction. So you would say like addiction happens anyways. So the way you would do this is to say, hey, trending lists are not the tipping point to addiction because addiction happens regardless of the existence of trending lists, as social media chooses many different ways to make people addicted to their platforms. They have algorithms, they have recommendations. Basically, you're saying that this is a cause, what do you call it? Like you say that this is a cause effect mismatch, or you say like this may be one of the reasons, but it's not a crucial reason, so it doesn't really matter. Yeah. Yeah, so like I also want to try one more example with this. Let's say that there is a motion that says this House, as the LGBTQ movement, would actively encourage closeted individuals to participate in the Pride Parade, which is a motion that is similar to the motion that was in like the most recent NEA-DC tournament, which is fun. Yeah. Yeah. Let's say that the government argument for this is if the LGBTQ movement encourages closeted individuals to participate, closeted individuals will go to the Pride Parade and experience how there are a lot of people in the LGBTQ movement and be more empowered. Let's say that this is an argument that can come from government, which I think is a possible argument that should come from government probably, because yeah, like this is probably what the debate wants to happen. And then if you were opposition, you could kind of tackle this argument using the tipping point analysis. So basically, you could say things like, firstly, the LGBTQ movement's encouragement is not the tipping point to people's participation, because like LGBTQ individuals like who are closeted would probably have reasons why they choose to be closeted in the first place, right? If they wanted to be open, then they would already probably be open. And if they are closeted, they would probably have their personal reasons that they are closeted. For example, their surrounding environment may be very like hostile towards queer people. They might live in a household that's very conservative. They might live in like a region where it's very like I don't know, like religious. So it's a sin to be LGBTQ, or like that could be the reason, right? So basically, the tipping point analysis regarding participation would be to say, hey, the LGBTQ movement's encouragement towards these closeted individuals is not the tipping point to make these people participate or come out, because these people have a lot of other reasons to stay closeted. Whether or not the LGBTQ movement encourages these individuals is not going to be the tipping point for these people to change their actions, right? And then the second way to like kind of do this is to say like, hey, like the Pride Parade is not the tipping point in closeted individuals realizing the community's existence and being empowered. And this is kind of different from the first tipping point analysis because you're trying to say that the impacts will happen anyways. Because whereas the first tipping point analysis is that the impact will not happen anyways, right? So basically the second tipping point would be like, because there are a lot of media platforms in the status quo that already show pride movements, there are a lot of internet communities that show the existence of queer individuals, there are a lot of methods in which queer individuals can have a sense of solace even if they don't come out. These people do not necessarily need to be empowered through the pride movement because they already have a society or community they can have access to, meaning that these people's like getting empowered from this LGBTQ like pride parade is not mutually exclusive. the LGBTQ movement's encouragement is not the tipping point to this kind of encouragement or like empowerment. So that would be the tipping point analysis that you can use here. And then the second thing I want to add here, the third thing I want to add here actually, is to just like note that if you've noticed, tipping point analysis are also mitigatory. So I think like in order for this to actually be effective, you should then compare this to why this is actually the problem, or then why is this the problem when the argument from the other team doesn't actually cause anything, right? Because the point of tipping point analysis is trying to say that whatever the opposition argues is not going to bring any changes, right? Then, like, the best you can do through tipping point analysis is neutralize the argument, not to say that it's like actually worse off, right? So I think when you're trying to use the tipping point analysis, you need to take the extra step to talk about then why is this actually harmful. And then this could be like part of your argument, right? So you could say like, the end of this tipping point analysis is that this kind of encouragement is not going to change the actions of the LGBTQ movement or help these people feel encouraged to come out or anything. But the reason why this is harmful is because these closeted individuals will feel coerced, and then they will feel like the LGBTQ movement doesn't like they can't fit into the LGBTQ movement because they have actively different agendas from them. And this would be like one of the ways that you can go about this and make the comparison about why your harms still stand, whereas the other team's benefits do not. Cool. So yeah, that was the rebuttal part that I wanted to talk about. And then after that, so as I think I kind of already covered this when I was talking about like the tipping point and the mitigation stuff, but like I think it's then important after making rebuttals to make comparatives, explain why your team's arguments that are left standing have more benefits or less harms compared to the other team, because I think that basically rebuttals are like kind of you trying to like diminish the arguments of the other team, you trying to deconstruct the constructive points from the other team, right? This means after you spend like maybe 2 or 3 minutes rebutting to the points of the opposition team and reconstructing your team, then you would have like the remaining stuff that came from the other team, and you would have your team, right? Then you need to draw a direct comparative of why then your team's arguments that are left standing are more important or like beneficial or have bigger impacts or have maybe more certain impacts compared to the other team, right? And this is where you can draw the comparative. You can say, so the conclusion of this analysis is on the comparative, we have much more benefits. The other team cannot prove why their benefits stand or why their benefits are mutually exclusive. This is why on the comparative, we are much better off. And this is maybe how you can make the comparative. Cool. The last thing I want to talk about is weighing. And when I mean weighing, basically the reason why you would weigh is because like even if you spent a lot of time trying to deconstruct the arguments of the other team, some portions of the other team's argument would be still left standing, and some your arguments probably will also be deconstructed to some degree. So if your arguments and the other team's arguments are left remaining to a similar degree, the way in which how you would judge which side's arguments won is to kind of weigh between the arguments, meaning that you would discuss which side's arguments are more important compared to the other team, right? And this is what we do. And basically, I brought mainly 6 different metrics that you can use for weighing. And like this is kind of like a toolkit that you can use to weigh comparing two arguments. The first thing would be to weigh in terms of scale. So if your argument impacts more people compared to the other team in a utilitarian calculus, then your argument is like going to be more important compared to the other team, right? Secondly, in terms of magnitude, if your arguments impacts like so let's say like your team's argument and the other team's arguments both impacts one person, but if the degree of impact that you can give to that person is bigger than the degree of impact that the other team can give to that person, probably your team's argument is going to be more important, right? So if you can say like, for example, let's say the other team is arguing for like UBI and you're arguing that like people should build schools. Let's say that for some reason that's comparative in the debate. Then you would say like, although the other team's argument can impact more people in terms of scale, the reason why your team's argument is more important is because in terms of magnitude, you help people learn more, you help people like have proper education, meaning that the degree of change that you can create in a person's life is much bigger than the other team. And this would be the comparative in the debate or the weighing in the debate. Thirdly is, I think, vulnerability. And vulnerability, I think, where while it's like a very low-hanging way to weigh, usually it's not the most effective way to weigh because probably the stakeholders that you are trying to discuss will not be that different. So the other team is probably also going to talk about vulnerable actors as well. But let's say that for some reason you chose the more vulnerable actor, then you can say like, because this actor is more vulnerable or this stakeholder is more vulnerable, because we help these vulnerable people more, then like our team's argument is more important compared to the other team. And that could be a metric that you can use to weigh. And the fourth is like short term and long term. And I think this is interesting because I think a lot of people, and I think this is also intuitive because like basically when some arguments impact people for the long term, then it means that people can gain impacts or gain benefits by that argument for a longer period of time. People are affected by the arguments for a longer period of time, meaning that like this is probably more important than short term, right? But I think it's also possible to argue for short term as well, because you could say that something is really immediate, that to the degree that it needs to be fixed in the short term. And if this problem is not dealt in the short term, then the long-term benefits are going to be meaningless to some degree. So for example, let's talk about, actually, I'm going to talk about the example on the next slide. And then I think the fifth one could be like irrevocable versus revocable. Basically, if something is irrevocable, meaning that you can't reverse the results of something, then it would be more important than something that is revocable. And then I think the sixth one could be like what the actor wants more, which could also be a metric to kind of like go about this. And I'm going to talk about how to apply these kind of like metrics in the argument on the next slide right now. Yeah, because I think this also becomes much more clear with examples. Yeah. Yeah. So let's say that there's a motion that says, this laws believes that NGOs should not provide humanitarian aid to conflict areas until those areas are stabilized. And yeah, so basically it means like NGOs like UNICEF or like, I don't know, like Save the Children or anything should not provide humanitarian aid if there are conflict areas, and conflict areas are still have like ongoing conflict, right? So basically it means like people these NGOs should only enter when conflict has like subsided or like, yeah. And then let's say the government's argument is like providing humanitarian aid leads to more casualties, because the analysis that the government gives is that if NGOs provide aid, this leads to more soldiers being able to benefit, and this leads to longer fighting. And longer fighting means that more people will die. This is because the conflict affects the region for a longer period of time. Let's say the opposition's argument is that providing humanitarian aid leads to less people dying, because these people in the war zones, a lot of people are hurt by warfare. People face dangers like starvation. This means that the help of the NGOs are crucial in these help people surviving the day. Yeah, let's say that this is the argument that opposition provides. If government and opposition both proved why these arguments are likely to a similar degree, then it would be a very important thing to kind of weigh and talk about which is more important, right? Like whether or not it's more important to end the war faster, or is it more important to like immediately help these people who are dying? So yeah, you could go about this by using the metrics that we just discussed, right? Like if you're trying to weigh by scale, maybe like if you were let's say, which side would you be? Yeah, let's say like your government and you try to weigh by like scale, then you would say, hey, like we're the one who actually impacts more people, because the reach that NGOs could have towards people who need humanitarian aid is going to be limited to some degree. But on the comparative, on the opposition, they are going to prolong conflict, meaning that this prolongation of conflict actually impacts more people. So the amount of people that you could help by directly giving them aid versus the amount of people you're impacting by prolonging the conflict, when you compare those two things, the latter is going to be much bigger. So you could say like the government wins in terms of scale. Our argument is more important in terms of scale. Then if you were to use magnitude, then you could say something like, for example, let's say you are um, 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 yeah, let's say perhaps like you're trying to use this as opposition. You could say something like, hey, like, it may be whereas it may be true that conflict might be prolonged on governments, and this you would like probably think this is not true, and you would already have provided a lot of rebuttals towards this, right? But you're biting the bullet and kind of trying to give them their best case, right? So you'd say like, even if we say that conflict is prolonged under our side, the people who are facing humanitarian crisis right now are dying right now. So it means if they don't have, well, like they don't have aid, humanitarian aid right now, then these people are going to die, meaning that the degree of harm that you're causing to these people are going to be more severe than the potential people who might be harmed due to the prolongation of conflict, right? So you could kind of say that the magnitude that of help that we are giving is very small, not very big under our side. Yeah. And let's try the third one. And yeah, third one, I think vulnerability isn't the best metric to use here because like both teams are trying to say that like they're helping the vulnerable people who are the civilians. But like, yeah, if you're opposition, you could say like vulnerable people are dying right now. It's important to help these vulnerable people. On a government, you could say like you're actually not helping vulnerable people. You're actually helping soldiers because like soldiers are going to be the ones who benefit from this aid. And let's try the fourth one, short term and long term. And I think this is where this gets really interesting. Because like you could say, if you're on government, then obviously you could say that our argument is more important because it gives more long-term benefits, right? Because when it comes to like humanitarian aid, just because you give humanitarian aid now doesn't guarantee like, I don't know, like so if you would say like if you give humanitarian aid right now, this is going to prolong the war, meaning that it will bring more long-term harm, meaning that this conflict is going to last long term. It's going to harm more people in the long term. It's going to be bad in the long term. So it's long term needs to be prioritized compared to short term benefits of helping people. That could be like government team's method of weighing, right? But if you're on the opposition team, you could also equally argue that short term is more important here because you could say something like, hey, look at the status quo. If these people do not get help right now, they are going to die right now. And if these people die right now, it doesn't matter to them whether or not the war is going to prolong or not, right? Because these people are already dead. So it's more important to help these people in immediate need because to these people, the emergent need of these people is more important to deal with compared to the potential long-term harms that may or may not happen. So like that's how I would say like immediacy or like urgency is more important to deal with in the short term. Fifthly, irrevocable versus revocableness. I think like this metric is like easy to use when you're discussing like these kind of motions because like the most irrevocable thing that teams could argue in a debate is like human like death because like death is like the most irreversible thing that could happen. So you could say like these people are gonna die right now if you don't give them help, or you could say people are gonna die in the long term, or you could say like if you're opposition, you could say like people are going to die right now in the short term if they don't get help, which is a irreversible harm. But war could also be like stalled by other methods, which is a reversible harm. So you could say like our team is more important. And then sixthly, what does the actor want more? I don't think this is directly applicable to this one because usually I think like actors here would probably want to have the same interests. But yeah, so like if you were to do an actor motion, you could kind of analyze the interests of the actor and talk about what the actor wants more in terms of like interests or like what they actually need or like what they actually want. So the bottom line here is I think the metrics that I like introduced here are just like kind of toolkits that you could keep in your toolbox and then use depending on the context that you have and depending on the argument that were provided by both sides. So yeah, I think like just taking note of these methods and using them at proper times and places really helps you to weigh your clash and like prove why your arguments are more important in a certain clash. Great. Yeah, so that's basically the material that I wanted to talk about today regarding whip speeches. I hope that this was helpful and I hope there were people that watched this because like, yeah, this is a recorded lecture, like great. But yeah, so like thank you for listening. If you have any questions, like please feel free to reach out to me anytime and I would be glad to help. Thank you.